The deed was signed on a Tuesday. My grandfather signed it at 9:14 in the morning, according to the notary stamp in the lower left corner. And I know that time because I have looked at that stamp more times than I can count. September 14th. The same week my father stood in front of 43 family members at the Henderson's Lake House and explained loudly why I didn't belong at the grown-ups table. He didn't know about the deed yet. Nobody did. That's the thing about quiet people, they tend to move first. My name is Renata. I'm an estate planning attorney. I've spent 14 years helping families divide what the dead left behind, and I can tell you with clinical certainty. There is no document more honest than a will, and no moment more revealing than the reading of one. What people believed they were owed tells you everything about what they thought they were worth. This story is about a house worth $2.5 million, a grandfather who said very little and planned everything, and a father who confused silence with surrender his entire life. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your kind of thing, drop a comment below and subscribe. There are people here who will understand exactly what you're about to hear. I became an estate planning attorney because of my grandfather. Not because he pushed me toward it. Grandpa Lev didn't push. He suggested. He showed. He handed me a newspaper article about a woman who lost her house because her name wasn't on the deed, and he said in his careful accented English, "Renata, paper is permanent. People are not." He came to this country with $400 and a brother who died before he turned 40. He built a landscaping business from a single borrowed truck. He bought the house on Sycamore Ridge in 1979 for $87,000. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 2 acres of land that he maintained himself until he was 81 years old. By the time I was in law school, comparable properties in that neighborhood were selling for north of $2 million. By the time this story ends, the appraisal would read $2.47 million. Grandpa Lev was precise about money the way immigrants often are when money was once the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. He kept his own ledgers by hand. He remembered the cost of every major purchase he'd ever made. He was the kind of man who read contracts before signing them and kept every receipt in a shoebox labeled by year. I learned from him. My father, Daniel, is his son. My uncle Marcus is also his son. My brother Tyler is Daniel's son, which makes Tyler Grandpa Lev's grandson. This will matter. Growing up, our family operated on an unspoken but very legible arithmetic. Daniel was the golden one. He was louder, flashier, more present. He called Grandpa Lev every Sunday without fail, sat at his right hand at every holiday table, volunteered opinions on everything the old man owned. He was also quietly not particularly good with money. 3 failed restaurant ventures. A boat he couldn't afford that he sold at a loss. A house in Scottsdale that went into short sale in 2011. But he showed up. He performed loyalty in the currency the family recognized. Volume and visibility. I showed up differently. I sent money without being asked. I reviewed Grandpa's lease agreements when he rented out the back studio apartment on the property. I drove the 3 hours to Sycamore Ridge every February to help him file his taxes. I sat with him in the hospital in 2019 when he had the cardiac event. And I sat with the cardiologist and took notes in a legal pad while my father sent flowers and a card that said, "Thinking of you." Nobody called what I did loyalty. They called it Renata being Renata. I didn't call it anything. I just did it. The Henderson family reunion happens every August at a rented lake house in the Catskills. 40-something people. 3 generations. A rental that runs about $12,000 a year, which my father has volunteered to organize since 2015, which everyone takes to mean he's paying for, which he is not. The cost is divided by household, and my household has paid our share every year on time via Venmo with no fanfare. This particular August, Tyler had just passed the bar exam. Tyler is 28. Tyler is the kind of person who accepted congratulations as his natural inheritance and had been planning, since approximately age 22, to take over the family assets, a phrase he used without irony, as though there were assets being held in trust for him. My father gave a toast. I don't have the exact words recorded anywhere, but I have the memory of them lodged somewhere near my sternum, so I'll give you the approximate transcript. He raised his glass and talked about legacy, about the Hendersons, about what it meant to carry a name. He talked about Tyler and the bar exam and how this family had always taken care of its own. And then he looked at me across the table. I was seated at the far end, next to my grandmother, who had been watching the whole thing with her water glass held very still, and he said, "Some of us built careers out of telling other people how to handle their money. Tyler's going to actually do something with it." He laughed. Several people laughed. My Uncle Marcus laughed hardest. My grandmother set her water glass down on the table with a small, precise click. I smiled. I picked up my phone. I opened my notes app and I wrote down the date, the time 7:48 p.m., and the approximate words because that is what I do. I document. The habit kicked in before my feelings did, and by the time my feelings caught up, I had already created the file. Later that night, sitting in the room I shared with my husband, I opened my laptop and reread the draft documents Grandpa Lev had sent me 2 months earlier for my professional review. He had asked me to look them over as his attorney. He said it very deliberately, not as my granddaughter, as my attorney. I read them that night with different eyes than I'd had in June. Grandpa Lev died on November 3rd. He was 87. He died in his own bed at Sycamore Ridge, which is what he had wanted, and the hospice nurse who was with him said he was calm. He had been calm his entire life. It was the thing about him that most people mistook for passivity. The attorney who handled his estate was a man named Gerald Park, a partner at a small firm in the county seat, about 20 minutes from the house. Grandpa Lev had worked with Gerald for over a decade. Gerald called me 2 days after the funeral and asked me to come to his office, not to the reading with the family, which was scheduled for the following Saturday. He wanted to speak with me first. I drove up on a Thursday morning. I sat across from Gerald in his office with its legal volumes and its smell of old paper, and he slid a document across the desk to me. A trust instrument. A revocable living trust, executed September 14th of that year. Grandpa Lev had transferred title to the Sycamore Ridge property into the trust in September. The trust named one beneficiary for the real property, me. Not my father. Not Tyler. Me, Renata, listed by my full legal name, described in a single phrase I will not reproduce in full but which translated to, the one who read the documents. He had written a letter to. Gerald handed it to me in a sealed envelope. I put it in my bag without opening it. I was not ready to read it in front of anyone. The second document Gerald showed me was a promissory note, dated 2009. My father had borrowed $340,000 from Grandpa Lev during the restaurant collapse. The note had a repayment schedule attached. The note had never been repaid. The note had a current balance with compounded interest of $412,000. My Uncle Marcus had a similar note, $180,000 borrowed in 2014, never repaid. Gerald looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Your grandfather wanted you to understand the full picture before Saturday." I read everything 3 times. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours without turning the lights on. My grandfather had not been passive. He had been patient. There is a difference that my family had spent decades failing to understand. The family arrived at Gerald's office on Saturday in the spirit of people, attending a birthday party where they expected to receive gifts. My father wore a blazer. Tyler wore a tie. My Uncle Marcus brought his girlfriend, who was not named in any document and had no legal standing to be there, but nobody said anything. They had been talking. I know this because my cousin Priya, Marcus's daughter, the only person at the Henderson reunion who had not laughed, texted me the Thursday before to tell me that her father and mine had been on the phone for 3 consecutive evenings. That Tyler had already called a real estate agent about the Sycamore Ridge property. That the agent had pulled comps. Tyler mentioned to Priya that he planned to list it in the spring. Once we sort out the paperwork. He said we. At the lake house I had smiled and picked up my phone. On the Thursday after Gerald's call, I picked up my phone and called my own attorney, not Gerald, my personal counsel, and told her to prepare letters. Gerald opened the reading with a summary of the estate. The liquid assets, about $280,000, were distributed as Grandpa had specified. A portion to my grandmother, a portion split evenly among all grandchildren, a small bequest to the hospice organization. Standard. Clean. Nobody in that room registered any alarm. Then Gerald reached the real property. He read the trust instrument in full. He named the beneficiary. My father's face moved through 3 distinct expressions in approximately 4 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was what I can only describe as arithmetic. He was recalculating something rapidly. The third was the face people make when they realize they have been sitting in a negotiation they thought was a conversation. That can't be right, my father said. He said it quietly, which surprised me. Gerald confirmed it was right. My uncle Marcus said, "He would have told us." Gerald said, "He did not choose to." Tyler looked at me directly for the first time that morning. He said nothing. If you've ever watched someone who forgot you existed suddenly remember your name the moment an asset was in play, you already know where this is going. Stay with me through this next part. It is the part one have rehearsed in my mind approximately 300 times, and I want to get every word right. They didn't wait long. My father called that evening. He did not open with condolences, which he had technically already offered, though briefly. He opened with, "There has to be a mistake." I said, "Gerald is very precise." He said, "Your grandfather was not well toward the end. You know that." I said, "I was with him in September, Dad." He was lucid. I did not add, "And he executed a trust while I was there, with a notary, at 9:14 in the morning." He said, "You work with estates. You know how to influence an elderly person." I let that sentence exist in the air for a moment. I said, "Do you have something specific you'd like to allege?" He did not. Tyler called 2 days later. He took a different approach, warmer, conspiratorial, the tone of someone who assumed we were on the same team against a shared injustice. He talked about what Grandpa would have wanted. He said the house belonged to the family. He said I was being selfish, that I was letting my career make me cold, that this wasn't who I was. I said, "Tell me what you think I owe you, Tyler. I'd like to hear you say the number." He stopped. I said, "Write it down if you prefer. My address hasn't changed." My uncle Marcus sent a text message at 11:43 p.m. on a Wednesday. The message said, "This family made you who you are and you're going to throw us away for a house." I screenshotted it. I filed it. The letters from my attorney arrived at my father's and uncle's addresses on Monday of the following week. The letters outlined the promissory notes. They were not threatening. They were informational. A summary of the outstanding balances, the accrued interest, and the options available to resolve the debt. Clean. Professional. The tone of someone reading a balance sheet. My father called my mother, who called my aunt, who called my grandmother, who called me and said only, "Renata, be careful." Not careful like stop. Careful like, don't let them see you move. I was careful. The call I had been waiting for came on a Friday. My father said there was going to be a dinner. The whole family. At Sycamore Ridge. He said it as though it were natural, as though the house were still what it had always been. A place where the family gathered and my grandfather cooked and everything was decided by the loudest people in the room. I said I would be there. I arrived at Sycamore Ridge at 6 p.m. with a leather folder. My husband stayed home. This was not a night for witnesses on my side. I wanted no one to protect, and no one to perform for. The dining room table was set for 11. My grandmother was in her chair at the head. My father sat at the opposite end, which had been my grandfather's seat, which he had never sat in before. I noticed that. I sat down without saying anything about it. The dinner was almost pleasant, which is the most dangerous kind. People pass food. My aunt asked about my husband. Priya caught my eye across the table and held it for a moment. She had known I was coming, and she had come anyway, and I understood what that meant. My father waited until the plates were cleared. Then he stood up. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about Grandpa Leviticus. He said the right things: the immigration story, the landscaping business, the house on Sycamore Ridge that the family had grown up around. He was not wrong about any of it. He was performing a version of grief that was also a legal argument, and he was doing it well, and if I had not spent 14 years reading exactly this kind of performance in exactly these kinds of rooms, I might have been moved by it. He said, "Grandpa wanted this house to be a place for family. We all know that. And we all know that certain decisions were made at the end, decisions that we have reason to believe don't reflect what he actually intended." He looked at me. "We think the right thing is for Renata to acknowledge that, and for us to find a fair solution. Together. As a family." Tyler nodded. Marcus nodded. Several people around the table looked at the tablecloth. My grandmother's hands were folded in her lap. I said, "May I say something?" My father, to his credit, said yes. He thought I was surrendering. I opened the leather folder. I said, "I want to start with the trust instrument, because I think it's important for everyone in this room to understand what Grandpa actually signed, and when." I placed the document on the table, and slid it so anyone who wanted to could see the notary stamp. September 14th, 9:14 a.m. He executed this 6 weeks after the reunion at the Henderson Lake House. After a complete and independent review by Gerald Park, who has represented him for 11 years, and after a capacity evaluation by his cardiologist, which is in the supporting documentation behind tab 2. The table was quiet. The promissory notes are behind tab 3. I did not raise my voice. I never raised my voice. My father borrowed $340,000 in 2009. My uncle Marcus borrowed $180,000 in 2014. Neither debt has been repaid. With compounded interest at the rate specified in the notes, which you both signed, and which are notarized, the combined outstanding balance is $592,000. My attorney's letters were informational. This is simply what the math says. My father said, "Renata." I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. Grandpa left a letter. I reached into the back of the folder. I'm not going to read all of it, but there's one line I want to share, because I think it's the thesis of everything he built and everything he decided. I unfolded the letter. I read one sentence. "I gave to the ones who asked, and I left something for the one who showed up." Nobody said anything. My uncle Marcus said, "He was manipulated." I said, "By whom?" "Gerald Park. His cardiologist." "The notary? Which of these licensed professionals do you believe participated in the manipulation of an 87-year-old man?" He didn't answer. My father tried a different register. His voice softened. He said, "This isn't you, Renata. You were raised to think about family." I said, "I am thinking about family. I'm thinking about the family he built, and the things he decided to do with it, and the fact that his wishes are documented, witnessed, notarized, and legal." I paused. "If you want to contest the trust, that is your right. Gerald can provide referrals to appropriate counsel. But I want you to understand. There is a capacity evaluation, there are 11 years of consistent estate planning documentation, and there are 2 promissory notes that would be submitted as counterclaims in any litigation." Tyler said, his voice loud, "You can't actually think he'd want this." I placed one more document on the table. A photograph. Grandpa Lev and me sitting at this same table in September, the day he signed the trust. His hand on my shoulder. Both of us looking at the camera. Gerald Park had taken it. He had suggested it, actually. He said it was good practice to document the signing in context. My grandfather was smiling. He was smiling like someone who had just finished something important. I said, "I think he wanted exactly this." Priya looked at the photograph and then looked down at the table. My father sat down. Not theatrically. He just sat down the way people do when the thing they were holding becomes too heavy. I closed the folder. I stood up. I said, "I'll be in touch about the promissory notes. Gerald has the contact information." I looked at my grandmother, whose hands were still folded in her lap, and whose face was the face of someone watching a thing happen that had already been decided a long time ago. I said, "Grandma, dinner was beautiful. Thank you." I left. I drove home in the dark with the radio off and my hands exactly at 10 and 2. The promissory notes were settled 8 months later. My father paid $210,000, the original principal restructured, with a payment plan my attorney drafted and he accepted without negotiation. My uncle Marcus paid $140,000 on the same terms. The remainder of each debt was forgiven, not because I was required to forgive it, but because Grandpa Lev's letter, which I read in full and alone in my car in a parking lot on a Tuesday night in November, had asked me to be generous where generosity was possible. I was. No contest was filed against the trust. Gerald had been thorough. The capacity evaluation had been thorough. My grandfather had been thorough. The house on Sycamore Ridge is mine. The appraised value at time of transfer was $2.47 million. I have not sold it. My father and I do not speak regularly. We speak at the holidays, briefly, and with the particular politeness of people who have seen each other's documents. He has not apologized. I have not asked him to. My uncle Marcus has been quieter. His daughter Priya calls me every few weeks. She is thinking about law school. I have given her reading lists. Tyler moved to Austin. He passed the bar and works at a mid-size firm doing commercial real estate. I heard this through Priya. I have nothing specific to say about Tyler. My grandmother lived at Sycamore Ridge until she moved to assisted living 2 years after Grandpa died. I spent that summer restoring the wraparound porch. I did some of the work myself, not because I was good at it but because he had been, and it seemed like the right way to be in the house. I found his ledger books in the back of the hall closet, labeled by year going back to 1974. I have them on a shelf in my office. The settlement money, the $350,000 recovered from the notes, went into a scholarship fund. Grandpa Lev had come to this country at 19 with $400 and a brother. The scholarship is for first-generation college students in the county where he built his business. The first recipients were named this past spring. Gerald Park was on the selection committee. I have the photograph from the trust signing on my desk. His hand on my shoulder. Both of us looking at the camera. Gerald took it at 9:22 a.m., 8 minutes after the signing. My grandfather is smiling. He knew. He knew the whole time. The thing about my family is that they were not monsters. They were people who had made a comfortable story about what they were owed and had lived inside it for so long that they had forgotten it was a story. My father believed he had earned the house by showing up loudly. He believed visibility was the same as value. He believed, I think, that the people who move quietly through a family, who pay on time and review the contracts and sit with the cardiologist and take notes, are moving quietly because they have nothing worth saying. He confused silence with concession. My grandfather never did. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had been confusing the two for 38 years. What they learned in Gerald Park's office, and what they learned at the dinner table at Sycamore Ridge, is that the person who never raised her voice had been, all along, the most dangerous one in the room. Not because of anything she intended. Simply because she paid attention and she kept the receipts and the receipts told the truth. I did not take the house from my father. I inherited it from a man who decided, with full legal capacity and a notary and an attorney and a photograph taken 8 minutes later, that I had earned it. He made that decision alone in his own time on a Tuesday morning in September, and he signed his name and watched the notary stamp the corner, and then he asked Gerald to take a picture. Paper is permanent. People are not. He told me that when I was 12 years old. I have been paying attention ever since. If this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room is often the most prepared, take that with you. And if you've ever been the one who showed up, paid attention, and got mocked for it anyway, your receipts are still valid. They don't expire. Drop a comment if you know someone who needed to hear this today. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. I'll see you then.